What's up, I'm NyVo. As mentioned in my last video, I conducted a double-blind ABX test at CanJam, and it was in my hotel room above CanJam in the same building. And I got 5 random participants that wanted to take the test, and I'm very thankful that they did that, let me do this test. And they were actually happy to do it as well, so it worked out. It was a pretty fun day. I would have done it longer, but I wanted to test out some of the toys on the CanJam floor, so it was kind of a balance between testing and trying out new gear. So I definitely wanted to try some things out too. So how did I do the test? So here's a quick look at what it looked like in my room and how I had it set up. So if you don't know what a double-blind ABX test is, it's where the test taker and the test giver are not able to see each other and they're in separate rooms. And the test giver does not know ahead of time what gear is going to be selected for the test. So you use some sort of randomizer. In my case, I didn't have my whole computer with me, so I just used my cell phone. And what I did is I used the stopwatch of my iPhone, and I would just hit start and then stop, and then whatever millisecond it stopped on, if it was an even number, then I used the more expensive gear. If it was the odd number, then I used the cheaper gear. So the gear here is a Moon 438J amp, a KN IHA 6 amp. And for the DAC side, actually there was one more amp that we used in one of the tests. We used the Shit Magni. And on the DAC side, we used a Hollow May L2 and a D10S from Topping. All right, so for the tests, what we did is we used a decibel meter and we volume matched the gear before each test. So I let each participant select their own volume, and what we do is we just let them listen to the song that they want to hear for a second, and we'll get the volume to where they want it and set it, and then from that point we'll match the other gear to the same volume using a decibel meter. And then on my side I annotate what volume level it has to be at to match the decibels. So then I'd go back and during the test I'm actually not only switching out the device but also changing the volume to match. On some of the tests I did not match the volume on purpose, just to show the difference of what happens if you do or don't do the volume matching. So what else? To do the volume matching, I used a pink noise track from YouTube. I typed in pink noise and used, I think it was the second one that came up I used. And basically I take the headphone off the person's head before I run that track, of course, so they don't want to, make them go deaf. And then I stick the decibel meter on the headphone, and then I don't touch the decibel meter because we don't want it to move and make the results inaccurate. And then I test the other gear. And that's pretty much how the test went. So there's also a curtain that I put up. I used some clamps and a green sheet kind of looking thing. It's actually a green screen. And I put that in between the listener and the amps, so they could not see the amplifiers. And I was, trying to make it careful so that they can't see anything. Some of the flaws in the test I'll go over real quick. I didn't realize till I got to CanJam that the D10S is RCA only, and I did not have a RCA switch box. So that's led to a couple of issues. So for one, I had to, after every single test, each and every test, I had to unplug the RCA from, all the gear and the USB, whatever, each time, just to make sure that, the test taker doesn't know what I'm doing. So I was trying to be careful that they don't really know what I'm doing. A more ideal scenario would be that I use an XLR DAC to test. I'd actually had an XLR switcher with me, but I couldn't use it because D10S is only RCA. So just a note in the future, if anyone else wants to host a double-blind ABX, that's a note. Another flaw that I had for the test. So I had two options for headphones for everyone to use. One was HD 800, the other was HD 600. I also gave people the option to bring their own headphone if they're more comfortable with that. However, everyone chose to use the HD 800, and I think all of the participants there, that was the first time hearing HD 800. I'm pretty sure. Now, as for the flaws, though, one thing I forgot is that HD 800, one of its characteristics is it has bad layering. So with HD 800, all the sounds sound like it's coming from the same distance, and there's not things near and far at the same time for the most part. Everything's kind of like at the same distance. And the reason that's kind of a problem with this test is because the things that make the DACs and amps stand out is their layering capabilities. So Hollow May is kind of known for having some decent layering, and but it also has good timbre. That's the general consensus from people, subjectivists. So kind of a bummer that I didn't use a headphone that tests that. And the same thing for 430HA, compared to a bunch of my other amps, I would say that it has better layering than a lot of my amps. So again, kind of a bummer, but I just sold my Sesfara right before the test, so I couldn't use that. It's a big bummer, but once again, for the next person, I hope someone else out there wants to replicate this test for themselves and try it with different gear and learn from my mistakes. And maybe you should try it with Sesfara or eStats or something very resolving that is chain picky. That'd be, something. Me personally, I think HD 800 is chain picky. I don't know if I would have got the DACs, being able to tell the difference so easily because of, one of the other flaws is Hollow May was running single-ended because D10S is only single-ended. So that's, the other flaw is I couldn't run Hollow May in XLR, which was how I always listened to it. So I've never listened to it single-ended, so I don't even know how it sounds that way. Another flaw is test number 5. Well, it's not really a flaw, but I guess it kind of is. I did decibel match it beforehand. However, the listener said that the results might be inaccurate because he did hear a volume difference. I'm going to go ahead and take his word for it that they weren't volume matched. But even though, I tested it, there's a possibility that the mic moved or something. So we'll take his word for it that test 5 is inaccurate. But he did get 100% of the answers correct on that one, and that was a DAC test. I think the biggest flaw of my test is that I had no one that identified themselves as being having a high level of experience. So I asked each person what their experience level was and their the best chain that they've heard, and I'll talk about that when we get to them. So what can we learn from this ABX test? I guess we have to look at the variables. So the variables are that we have different amplifiers and different DACs and different people and different decibel levels that are done at each test. So what we can figure out is, do amps matter more or do DACs matter more? And can everyone hear the difference of different amps or DACs? Or is it just dependent on the person? So could it be different from person to person? Which might explain some of the other things. People say that it's not possible to hear a difference, and other people say that it is. So maybe we'll figure out if that's really the case. And since each person's at different decibel levels, we can test to see if the people hearing the differences are just at a louder volume or quieter volume or whatever. So that's what we can hopefully figure out from this series of tests. There's also sorts of other things that you can do with ABX tests, like testing cables and testing MP3 versus FLAC, etc. But for the sake of time, I just kept it fairly simple. If you guys want to do your own test, I encourage you to do that. All right, so let's get to the test takers. Let me talk about how the testing worked real quick. So beforehand, I mentioned to all the test takers that the first test that we do within the series of tests, we'll throw out the answer because they, haven't really had time to evaluate the gear. This is their first time hearing this gear. Keep in mind. That might be another thing that you guys want to do, and if you do another ABX test, is give people 10 minutes to play with the gear before they do it. I don't know. It's kind of hard because it takes so much time to do this that it's hard to do a test like that. But if you have the time, I just didn't, I wanted to get into CanJam. So test one was Jeremy, and he identifies his skill as moderate, and the best chain he's heard was a BHSE plus the Stax SR009S, which is a pretty good chain. So he does have a decent amount of experience, even though he identifies himself as moderate. He might think his listening level is moderate, even though he's heard some pretty good gear. Anyways, his results, he is 100% accurate. And what's interesting about this, though, is he preferred the cheaper amp every time, which so the IHA 6 versus 430HA. Real quick, what I think the differences are is the 430HA. Well, first of all, it's not a Class A, but it has a lot more power. The IHA 6 also is pretty powerful, but the difference is on sound is the IHA 6 frequency response is just more full sounding. There's not really any dips or anything. I hear, me personally, on IHA 6, it sounds like there's less emotion in the music for whatever reason, and 430HA normally does better staging than IHA 6, and there's better layering, but like I said, for the HD800 there is no layering, like pretty much ever, not any good layering anyways. And there's better instrument separation on 430HA, which again would be harder to hear on HD800. So anyways, he got that 100% correct. Test 2 was from Jacob, and this is the same test with amps. I forgot to write his decibel level, but we, decibel matched his as well. He identifies his skill level as mediocre, and he owns a ZMF Atrium with an SA1 and an SMSL SU8, and he does not have any further experience at that point in time. He didn't even go on the showroom floor yet, so his skill level, it's not, he hasn't heard a lot of gear. So his test result was inconclusive. He was basically getting the answer wrong half the time. So let's see what the next test is. It's Jacob again, but this time it's Dacs. And he was 100% accurate on the DAC differences. But something that I did not disclose to anybody. So we did the volume matching in front of everyone, but me behind the curtains, I could decide if I'm volume matching or not. And for his, I decided not to volume match. So he got 100% accurate with the DACs that were not volume matched, which is fairly expected because there is a difference in volume naturally, because the hollow May output is stronger than it's supposed to be, so it makes things louder than it should normally be. So anyways, that likely affected the results. So the next test was from Jay, and Jay identifies his skill level as being from beginner to intermediate, and his chain at home is a hollow spring KTE with a SA1 and an LCD 2C. My personal opinion about that chain is that I'm not a huge fan of the SA1, and I think the stage is too small on it. And the LCD 2C, there may be some unit variation on that headphone, but the one that I heard was really bad. It actually made me nauseous. So I've heard some people say they like that headphone, and it definitely was not the same headphone I was listening to. It was really hard to listen to, and the imaging on that was really jacked up. It sounded like there's 3 singers at once, like a blurry, like it was just really bad. But there might, it could have just been unit variation. I don't know. And he said that the best gear he heard at CanJam was a ZMF Caldera on a tube amp. So I actually have not heard that, but I've heard from plenty of people that it is a good headphone. So I'll take that as if he does have some experience listening to some high-end stuff, but he identifies himself as being beginner to intermediate. Now his amp test, it was inconclusive. He was not able to, if you get results higher than 70 something percent, then that probably is a good clue that you are hearing a difference. But he's right around a little over 50, so it's not. Basically, I would say he can't hear the difference on the amps enough to say which one is better or worse. Oh, by the way, I had them annotate G or B, and G meant good and B meant bad. It didn't. Now, okay, we weren't trying to say one is good and one is bad. The whole point was just to make it easier for them to write down which one they thought was better or worse, and that's all that really means. So throughout the test, they were all mentioning, "Well, I didn't think any of them were bad. They all sound really good." So, it's just a way to annotate it. That's all. For the DAC side, and I'm sorry that sounded condescending. I was just trying to make a voice. It just came out that way. Anyways, so for James with the DAC, he was 100% accurate, and this one we did volume match it, but for whatever reason he was hearing a difference in volume. Now I don't know what to do about this test, because I do want to take his word for it that the volumes were way off, but there's the other side of it too, is that the DACs do behave differently on the frequencies, on different frequencies. So he might have been actually hearing the difference of the DACs, but I can't say for sure. So I kind of just want to throw this test out. Even though he's 100% accurate on the DAC differences, I'm just going to go with his word for it that the volume difference was too different. So that would have thrown off the difference, So no way to prove it one way or the other. So I'm just going to throw the test out. Test number 7 was Corey, and he considers himself very novice. And his personal best chain that he's heard was he owns a Zendac and Kato's, which it's an IEM and a pretty good budget DAC amp. So it's definitely not a high-end gear. So I will believe him that his experience level is very novice. His score, he listened at 80.6 decibels, and his score was about 50-50, so his results were inconclusive. He basically could not hear the difference of the amps. On the DAC side, same thing. After the 5th round, he said he thinks he hears a difference, and at that point, he still got one wrong. So still the results, I would say, were inconclusive, which means that at this point in time, he can't hear the difference for the DAC either. So he couldn't hear the difference for the amps or the DACs. So the next test, we went back to Jeremy, who was our first test taker, and we did the DAC side. He used Daft Punk's Lose Yourself to Dance this time. And for the first tests, he was 100% accurate on the DACs. So he got them 100% accurate. And then he thought he was done, and he sounded pretty confident. And then I threw a curveball, and I volume matched the DACs. Because beforehand, this was out without taking a break or anything. I just told him we're doing more tests. And then I volume matched him. And then he had a harder time determining which DAC was which. Inconclusive again. He once they're volume matched, he could not tell the difference on the DAC. Test number 9 was Ollie, and he considers himself to be a beginner - casual audiophile. And the best headphone that he owns is a DCA Stealth, so I'm surprised that he said beginner because that's a fairly advanced headphone. And I asked him what his best chain was, and he said a Spring 3 into a Nautilus, and then I said, okay, what headphone? And he had a large list of headphones, including Expanse, which he must have heard that day because that's the first day it was, premiering, and ZMF stuff, and I can't remember what else. And he also heard the Warwick Aperio, so that's one of the most high-end headphones, price-wise. And I mentioned that I do think that's a really good headphone too. It's just not my cup of tea. Anyways, so as a beginner to casual audiophile, he said, he said he was a beginner. His results, he was 100% accurate, but he did not answer 2 of the, he skipped 2 of them because he didn't know. But the ones that he did answer, he's 100% accurate. And that was at 71.9 decibels, and he thought the 430HA was the better amp. Now, I did a interesting thing because we saw some differences in volumes earlier, so I had him do the same test again, but instead of 71.9 decibels, we did it at 80.8 decibels. And this time, he was 100% correct again. But the weird thing was, he switched which amp he favored at the higher volume. So at the lower volume, he liked the 430HA, and at the higher volume, he liked the IHA 6. So pretty interesting. That's to me, that's really interesting. Then we had him test the DACs, and this was at 80.7 decibels, and the results were inconclusive. He couldn't. They're not high enough percentage to call it one way or the other. So he basically could not hear the difference in DACs. So I think that pretty much sums it up. I guess if I were to summarize this, I'd say amps make the biggest difference for sure. And the more expensive amp is not always the best one. It depends on preference and your style of music and the headphones you have, etc., etc., etc. So, when you're buying headphones, you want to test it with various amplifiers. Don't just get one thing you like here and one thing you like there and expect it to sound good. You want to try, if possible, try the things all together. And as for DACs, they obviously make less difference. And when they're volume matched, they're really hard to tell the difference. So I think that really tells you if you're gonna put your money on something, it should be the headphone and the amp, and the DAC can wait. Now, I was kind of disappointed that there was no one in the test that identified as high skill, because I think if we did, and if we had like a Sesfara or an ESTAT or something, I'm pretty sure that we would have had more accurate results on the DAC side. So I guess I would say I hope that someone else follows in my footsteps and does their own ABX tests and learns from my mistakes, and basically gets I'm going to challenge some of you audiophiles out there to try this test. I mean, if you're recommending gear to a lot of people that are really expensive, then you should try the test yourself. And I'm willing to take this test myself. So if someone wants to test me, sure, go ahead. I don't care. All right, so I guess that's it. I'll see you guys later.